Hello there, historians. Mrs. Hopwell here, coming to you live from her kitchen. I am trying to find a space in my house where I'm not going to disturb my children who are all working, and so it's either the kitchen or upstairs in the bathroom, so I thought the kitchen was better. Now, I thought I'd give you some history lessons in this time of lockdown, the opportunity to teach you things about history, what I know. I am passionate about history, I love it. There's so much to tell you, and ultimately I'm going to hopefully give you a whole chronological series of stories all about British history and how kings and queens and past events shaped the democracy that we live in today. So let's begin, because there's lots to get through and I don't want to bore you too much. My first question to you was, how did a spider help a king? Okay, so lots of you have replied, and the king in question was somebody called Robert the Bruce. And Robert the Bruce was a Scottish king. He was hiding in a cave, and he was very fed up in this cave, and he discovered by watching a spider rebuild her web over and over again that actually he needed to also persevere in his ambition, which he had to overcome the English in Scotland and make Scotland an independent country. He managed to succeed in this. In 1314, he fought a battle called the Battle of Bannockburn, where the English army was defeated on Scottish soil, and King Robert the Bruce became firmly established as the nation's king in Scotland. It's very important because you'll see later that because he managed to do that, he managed to then create a dynasty which controlled Scotland for the next 300 or so years, and ultimately his descendants became the kings of England and Scotland because we came together as a nation in 1707 and became something called Great Britain. But before then, a long time before then, we were separate nations. We were England and Scotland, and it's quite important and it's quite interesting because currently politically that situation might be about to change. Now, let's go back then. So the spider in the cave and Robert the Bruce. Let's go back even further actually. Let's go back 100 years before Robert the Bruce was in his cave, and let's look at briefly the reign of King John. Now King John was a bad king. He was notoriously bad even at the time when he was alive. People thought he was shocking. He did many shocking things. And so much so that he ended up having to be forced to sign something called Magna Carta by his barons in 1215, on the 15th of June 1215 actually, so we're coming up to the 15th of June, so it's like the anniversary of it. Now Magna Carta, which means the Great Charter, its actual proper title was Magna Carta Libertatum, which means Great Charter of Freedoms, was a document which made sure that barons and people had the right to a proper court hearing, prison rights if they got arrested and sent to prison, things like food standards, even actually women and children and inheritance law and things like that. So Magna Carta was really progressive. But King John was not happy about it. He wanted to make sure that any estates that happened, if someone were to die, then he would get control of the estates and the money and all the sort of rights that he'd signed away. He didn't want to do that. So he asked the Pope at the time to say, this is wrong, please will you annul it? So the Pope said, okay, that's fine. So the Magna Carta was annulled, and that means it became completely void. It didn't mean anything. Obviously the barons, who were quite keen for this to happen, were very cross, and they started the First Barons' War after 1215 was happened. So King John panicked, he ran away, and he ended up in northern Norfolk with all his treasures and his horses and his carts. And in northern Norfolk there is a place called the Wash, which is a big area of sandy beach, and on that he lost all his treasure. It all got stuck in the mud and disappeared. And then King John died. Now King John, before he died, he had a family, and he had a son with his wife, and his son was called Henry. So Henry became king when his dad died, and Henry became Henry III. Now Henry was only 9 years old when he became king, which is quite amazing, and he was very little and young really to take on such a massive role of responsibility. Consequently, he was quite a bad king. He didn't do very well as a king, and people were quite critical of how he reigned. He did lots of expensive wars overboard. He abroad. He ended up giving all the positions of power to his friends. He built castles and gave them to his friends. He was generally quite badly disliked. He also raised taxes to pay for the wars abroad. He did start to build Westminster Hall down in London, which is a place that's still there today, as a view to being a place where Parliament could sit, which is quite interesting. But by and large, Henry III was quite rubbish. So we'd had King John, who was rubbish, and then Henry III, who was rubbish. But Henry III had 2 children, the first of which was Edward, and the second of which was a daughter called Margaret. Now, she's important. We'll come to her in a minute. But Edward I was a very important English king. That's Edward I, okay? He was an amazing king who realised that he needed to unite England and make it a stronger country. Scholars at the time even referred to him as a great and terrible king. He was very, very formidable. His first attention was drawn to the Welsh because the Welsh were rebelling against the English law that was being put on in their land, and they weren't happy about being ruled by the English. They wanted to remain Welsh. So Edward I set off and went into Wales and subjugated them and sort of squashed them and made sure that they were actually doing what he was wanting them to do. And in order to do that, he built something called a Ring of Iron, which is a ring of castles, amazing castles all over Wales. Here's Carnarvon Castle, and its design was based on a design that Edward I had seen when he went on crusades in Jerusalem, which in itself is an amazing story. He went to Jerusalem with his wife, which was very unheard of as a king, to go off with his wife to Jerusalem. And when he was there, he was almost assassinated when an assassin climbed into his bedroom one night when he was sleeping. It's fascinating. Anyway, Edward I built all these castles all over Scotland, Wales, and managed to subjugate them. And then his attention turned north to Scotland. Now, he wanted to do something called, he wanted to unite Scotland and England together because he thought that would make a stronger nation. It's called suzerainty, and it means to have political control over a different country. Now, people in Scotland weren't, not everybody, but quite a few people weren't very happy with this idea. They wanted to remain independent and Scottish. But the king at the time, Alexander III, here he is, looking a bit wonky, Alexander III was also of the same idea of trying to use diplomacy and marriage to unite England and Scotland. Now, Alexander III had married Margaret, who was Henry III's daughter, sister to Edward I, and she went off up to Scotland, and actually Margaret and Alexander III were apparently very happily married. She gave Alexander 3 surviving children. She gave, the first was a daughter who was called Margaret, who was born in Windsor, and then the other 2 who survived, who were born in Scotland, were called Alexander and David. However, by 1286, unfortunately, Alexander III's wife had died, Margaret had died, and his 3 children had died, Margaret, Alexander and David. Now, his first daughter, Margaret, had at the age of 20 gone and married Eric, the King of Norway, and she'd gone to live in Norway. But while she was giving birth to her first daughter, who was also called Margaret, she died in childbirth. But the little girl survived. Now, in 1286 as well, when Alexander III wanted a new wife, he found a new wife, and he was just going out to visit her one stormy evening when his horse tripped and fell on a rabbit hole, and he was thrown and he died. So it was all a bit of a nightmare. Edward I realised that diplomacy and marriage wasn't really going to work as such, except for the little girl, Margaret, who was in Norway. Edward decided that it would be quite a good idea still if his son, Edward II, were to marry the little girl who's in Norway. She's called Margaret the Maid of Norway. So there was arrangements made, and little Margaret the Maid of Norway was put on a boat, and the boat was sailed back across the North Sea to Scotland. But the weather was so atrocious that her ship, the boat she was on, got blown off course and ended up in Orkney when she was supposed to be landing at Leith outside Edinburgh. And the crossing was so bad that even people died, including her. She was only 7 when she died. So that means that Edward II never ended up marrying Margaret the Maid of Norway. Ultimately, there was no royal family on Scottish soil that was in control of Scotland, and this is where lots of political shenanigans start happening. Edward I realises that he has to control Scotland. He needs to get that control of Scotland, and he's going to go to any means he can to do it. Diplomacy and marriage have failed because there's nobody left who can do it, but he can use brute force. He can take his army into the Scotland area, and he can make the Scottish people do what he wants to do. So, with his support, he supports a man called John Balliol, who wanted to become the King of Scotland. And with the army, the English army behind him, John Balliol does become the King of Scotland, but he is a puppet king. In other words, he does exactly what Edward I wants him to do. Here's a picture of him. He was actually nicknamed Toom Tabard, which means empty coat, which means effectively that he was useless. And ultimately, Edward I, who put him there, got so fed up with Toom Tabard that he fired him and sent him off to France, live in France for the rest of his days. He was just hopeless. But because John Balliol was on the throne of Scotland and doing what Edward I wanted him to do, there was a big uprising in the desire for independence in Scotland. And now we need to introduce the character of William Wallace. Now, William Wallace was a knight in Scotland who was desperate for Scotland to become completely independent. And he became the guardian of Scotland after a battle called the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Now, the Battle of Stirling Bridge was between Scotland and the English army. And on this occasion, Edward I didn't go north to oversee the battle because he was back down in London being a bit ill. But the Battle of Stirling Bridge was a massive success for the Scots. Stirling Bridge was a narrow wooden bridge, and it meant that the English army had to cross it carefully with two men riding both side by side, but that's all they could get across at one time. And so this long cavalcade of English armies were coming over the bridge, and they basically got slaughtered by the Scottish army who were waiting on the banks on the other side on the hill with arrow fire. In fact, the only surviving English knight who managed to get it back across the bridge, back to the English camp on the other side of the bank, was somebody called Marmaduke Thweng, which is a tremendous name, and here's his coat of arms. Marmaduke Thweng he became a legend really, in that he'd managed to survive the battle, and people lauded his skill at managing to, come back alive. However, basically, the Battle of Stirling was a massive success for Wallace and for Scotland, and Wallace became the guardian of Scotland, and people were very happy. Edward I wasn't happy though down in London. He realised that things needed to be changed. So fast forward a few more months and you get to the Battle of Falkirk. Now, Falkirk was a battle where William Wallace was betrayed and he lost, but Edward I had ridden up to the Battle of Falkirk to watch and organise what had gone on. So it was a bit more organised, it was a bit more lethal. Edward I was an amazing tactician at battles. So William Wallace got betrayed by some Scots of his own nation at the Battle of Falkirk because some Scottish people wanted there to be unity between Scotland and England. They thought that it was beneficial to Scotland. So they betrayed William Wallace to the English, and he got arrested and sent down to London, and he was tried as a traitor, and he died in a particularly sticky, horrible end, which I won't go into. But William Wallace was unfortunately no more. Now, it was important, Falkirk was important for one particular man who was on the council of advisors for William Wallace, and that man was called Robert Bruce. Robert Bruce was also keen on becoming King of Scotland because he had a claim through his grandparents, and it goes back a bit. Robert Bruce realised that the time was ripe for him to claim kingship, and in 1307, I think, he became King of Scotland. He was a formidable sort of tactician as well. He knew how to fight against the English who were on Scottish soil. He created a barren earth policy where any of the English army invading the lowlands of Scotland would find no food to eat, no places to go, because he made sure all the farmers who were living in that area burnt all their crops and there was nothing to sustain an invading army. Robert the Bruce invaded down to Yorkshire. He was fairly keen on making sure that the English army were nowhere near Scotland. However, Edward I realised that he was a formidable opponent, and he would send the English army up and fight against Robert the Bruce. And Robert the Bruce after a period of time, lost various bits of land, lost men, lost armies against the English because they were being controlled by Edward I. At this point, we have the beginnings of the story of Robert in the cave. Now, after one particularly gruesome battle, the English army managed to get hold of Robert the Bruce's family. They killed most of Robert the Bruce's children. They left alive his wife, his sister and his daughter, and they took them to a castle on the borders of Scotland called Roxburgh Castle, and they put them in cages hanging on the outside of the castle walls. Horrendous, can't imagine. Robert the Bruce's sister was a lady called Mary Bruce, and she was particularly vehement, apparently, against the English soldiers and army. And because she was so angry and cross about them, she was kept in her cage outside the castle walls of Roxburgh for 4 years. And then ultimately she was brought inside and then kept for another 4 years inside Roxburgh Castle as a prisoner. But she must have been an unbelievably determined woman to survive all that. Now, so Robert the Bruce was defeated by the English, and he'd had various people leave his army and disappear, and so he ended up feeling very low when he went into the cave where he found the spider, and he was observing the spider and watching it persevere, and he realised that that's what he needed to do. So he got himself together. He went round all of Scotland, which of course by this time was united because Alexander III had united it. He went to all the islands, he went to as far as the Highlands, he went up to Orkney, he went to Shetland, he went everywhere to gather support. And when he managed to get all his support and got himself together, he was ready for a battle. Now, fortune interceded at this point because Edward I, who'd also realised that Robert the Bruce was probably up to something, he'd ridden north to meet and battle with Robert the Bruce. But by this point, he was getting to be an old man. He rode up to a place just outside Carlisle called Burr by the Sands, and he died. And his body was interred it was laid to rest in Lanercost Priory. And then Edward I's body was packed into a wine barrel, my understanding, and then sent down to London to be interred in Westminster Abbey. So Edward I had died. His son, Edward II, became king, but he wasn't the same tactician, he wasn't the same soldier, he wasn't the same determined king like his dad had been. Robert the Bruce seized the opportunity, with a weaker English king on the throne, to attack the English army in Scotland. They met at the Bannock by the Burn, and the Battle of Bannockburn happened in 1314. It was a resounding success. The Scots won massively. The English were totally routed, and they had to escape as much as they can. Even the Clifford, who lived in Skipton Castle at the time, he died at the Battle of Bannockburn. And so you get Robert the Bruce on the throne of Scotland, absolutely secured as king. Now, his daughter was a lady called Marjorie. She married somebody called Walter Stewart, who was the steward to Robert the Bruce. A steward was a man who looked after the king. He probably brought his clothes, he sorted out his meals, he probably even sorted out his diary, if there was such a thing at those times. And Walter Stewart and Marjorie began a family, and they founded the Stuart Dynasty, which then became the most longest running dynasty in Scottish history. It lasted for the next 300 and so years, and ultimately, when Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, the throne passed to James VI of Scotland and James I of England and Scotland, and he was a Stuart king. And then all sorts of things started to happen politically and democratically for England. And so that is super important. If Bannockburn hadn't happened, if Robert the Bruce hadn't seen the spider, allegedly, just persevering, he wouldn't have carried on. Bannockburn wouldn't have happened, and Marjorie wouldn't have married Walter Stewart, and the Stuart dynasty wouldn't have existed. It's fascinating and amazing, and I think it's well worth telling. So I hope you've enjoyed this very brief babble. I'm sorry if it's so babbly. And next week, I'm going to be looking at another Stuart monarch who had a particular liking for marmalade and why the marmalade was so important. See what you can find out. Have a go at the quiz. Let me know how you did, and I'll see you tomorrow. Sorry, not tomorrow, next week. Sorry for babbling. See you later. Bye.